Hi, I'm Jennifer Carter, and thank you for joining me on a podcast for parents, teachers, and administrators. Today's conversation should be a good one, and I'm sure it's something on your mind. So let's get to it. So just to get ourselves started, can you introduce yourself and then share what your connection to early childhood education, or because it's a podcast for parents, teachers, and administrators, what's your connection as a parent, teacher, or an administrator?
Great. Okay. So I am Anisha Angella. So my connection, so I'm located in Toronto, Canada. And my connection is I am an early childhood professional by trade, registered in Ontario, Canada, as a professional. And then also I am just an advocate for early learning. I've worked in many different positions in the field, such as, as an educator, supervisor, director. I've done some corporate work where I was working alongside both families and in the centers as well to connect and be sure everybody's doing great within the center, stuff like that as well. And I also do work as a professor as well. So I do some sideline work as a professor at some of the colleges here in Ontario. And now within my business, I do consulting and coaching. So my main world is to empower and help educators and professionals in the field feel absolutely confident in the work that they do every day and the contribution they have to society, which we were speaking about as well as, we're working every day to be sure that society is aware of our importance in education. So that's a lot of the work that I do in my coaching and consulting part.
Got it. As a consultant and a coach, and because you're in Toronto, which is actually positioned quite uniquely, and you said that you have a connection with people who are in Cleveland, which of course is in the United States, you're uniquely positioned to kind of straddle both what happens in Canada and what you see happening in the United States. In those two things, in those two places, can you see where one, like Canada is doing really well at this, whereas the United States is really doing well at something else?
Yeah, very good question. Of course, I'm going to be slightly biased because I am Canadian. I will say that, looking at the two aspects that Canada and in Ontario, especially Toronto, we're a little bit progressive in the sense of compliances. So when looking at licensing and stuff like that as well in education, in terms of, quality of centers, there's a long list of compliances that we have to follow that, in conversation with a lot of people in the community outside of Canada, those compliances don't exist. It's usually based upon the center to make the choice on, what is a compliance. I gave the example about allergies. I'm an allergy advocate, and I've spoken to a few people in New York where there isn't necessarily a compliance that says that there has to be a posting with the child's name and all that stuff as well. Whereas here in Canada, that's 100% a compliance, and some centers can really get in big trouble if they're not doing it here. So I would say we're progressive in that way, as well as the just the definition of quality is a little bit more streamlined in the sense that it all comes together and, it's easy to identify with what quality looks like. Whereas in the States, I think that there's a little bit of it really depends on the owner's vision, and it depends on the center's vision of quality, which can be really great too, because I've seen some amazing centers open up in the States, and that's just because the owner's vision matches alongside with quality. But at the same time, there's the aspect where sometimes the director or the owner's vision doesn't really match up to what quality is, and then you see the program kind of brought down with that as well. I would say the bonus side to, the US is there is wiggle room for creativity and to be able to create your own without having those heavy compliances on you. So you can kind of pick and choose what route works best for your program. Whereas in Canada, there's a little bit of restrictions in terms of making those changes as well. So it gives an opportunity for owners that have that out of the box thinking to really take a plunge into something different.
It's interesting that you say that, and that's the thing that you see as kind of, the differences between the two pluses, minus, pros, con, because I see that at Oak Tree. So, I have the Oak Tree Learning Center in San Bernardino and Oak Tree in LA. And because I started my teaching career centuries ago, and I've become like a researcher, I'm a curriculum nerd. I really am interested in the connection between assessment, pedagogy, and curriculum design. And I always call it, like I refer to it in my book as a healthy ecosystem of learning, right? Because if one is off, the others suffer.
Yeah.
And within that, though, we do a more progressive style where I've looked at like different, like Emilio Reggio has some great stuff. Actually, that old school worksheet and rote memory, they have some great stuff. And because I have the flexibility, I was able to put it into a curriculum that's really effective, especially with kids, who fall into the achievement gap. So I have that flexibility here because we have so many kids that come from so many different backgrounds and so many teachers who also come from a lot of different backgrounds, because we can't underestimate training as well. Mm-hmm. So how do you reconcile that in Canada, especially in Toronto, because Toronto is I guess is a two-part question. Do you have the same achievement gap that we have here in the States? And then because you said it's more prescriptive, how do you approach the variety of learning and learners, because it is pretty prescriptive?
Yeah, that's an excellent question. I think in regards to what you said, it's a little bit, it's hard and it's not hard. I say that it's hard because there are a lot of people, especially in the world of, being an owner of a center, that have the exact vision that you have, where it's not just one type of learning style or one type of way of doing things and approaching education. Right. And I know that there's a lot of centers that actually try their best to approach it, but I know there's little room to add those parts into the centers because most of the centers are following the play-based approach, where you have to kind of figure out how you can implement those things like worksheets and stuff like that, which I am pro worksheets as well, as long as it's done, creatively and there's a focus point and all those things as well. But, we have licensing here where they're going into centers and they're seeing worksheets, and that's deemed as something that's not okay, right? So I feel like there are centers that have gone above and beyond by using the current curriculum model and the play-based model and the Montessori model, and kind of making it their own. But it's just about being able to prove to licensing and ministry and the compliance officers that they're still following all the expectations that are needed there, which means a little more work on our side. So there's ways to fill the gap, but it really depends on the director and owner taking that extra step to make sure that it makes sense with what they have. So in my consulting world, I work with a lot of centers that have the same vision as you, where they want to have like a program plan where it fits the play-based model, but they have, take-home worksheets, and they have different stuff to make sure that those main aspects of education is being fulfilled before they head off into grade 1, grade 2, and grade 3. So it's just about the owners and directors getting really creative in implementing it within what we have to offer.
Mm-hmm. I mean, I think because we don't use worksheets. Actually, we have our curriculum. So everything that happens at the center, we try to make it as student-led, not just student-centered, student-led as possible. So we just had graduation. They made the programs, they did the set design, they made their costumes. And within that, though, like our 2-year-old practice fine motor, color identification, counting, because they have to have sets of things. In contrast to our 5-year-olds, where they had to write things out, they had to do some memorization of, poems and things like that. So we get at those concrete skills. We do worksheets like spelling tests and things like that, because when you have something where every day, literally every day, you're learning how to do something for a purpose, and then you go into school and frankly, American school is not like that. It is very worksheet heavy. It is very concerned about testing.
Yeah.
And, I don't know about you, but I haven't had to sit down and take a test for anything in a very long time.
Avoid it all.
Like I'm preparing kids for life, and school can prepare them for that other stuff, right? But I want it to be like relatively familiar. I don't know. What are you preparing literally, what are you preparing your kids for up in Canada? Like, are you doing the worksheet and testing, or are you trying to get them more real life skills?
You know what? It is a mix of both. I feel like it's pretty much the same in the sense of wanting the classroom to be led by the child. So moving away from product-based learning where everything needs to look the same. So as simple as like an art activity, you have a penguin. Not every child penguin is going to look like a penguin. It's going to look like whatever their mind thinks it is, right? So we do have the creativity piece and stuff like that. So this is aside from licensing and compliances and having more of a focus in observation. There is heavy observation actually here in Canada in terms of how they develop programs and activities for children. So going back to the play-based model, so the teachers will take their time in observing the children, seeing what their interests are, so basically interest-based, and trying to develop a learning experience based upon the interests of the child. So that's mainly the focus points. What's great is I've actually more recently met quite a few people that are moving towards a similar model like you, where it's more about lifelong skills. So there's one of my clients actually specifically, she has a school that she's opening that is beautiful, and it's about teaching them, financial literacy. We don't learn financial literacy. I'm learning it till this day. Like it's a thing. So that's for sure. So there are innovative way of doing things. And I feel like people are now moving away from the traditional and exploring what non-traditional learning and unlearning what it looks like, which is amazing. But childcare and early childhood today, it's about interest focus. So you can get the interest of the child. And it just takes a little work from the educators to get creative with implementing those skills into so if they're interested in ladybugs, you're going to teach them how to count with ladybugs. You're going to teach them how to draw. So it's about more interest-based to grab the child's attention with some other lifelong skills as well. But it's really focused on the interest and using observations to be sure that all the skills are being implemented.
I mean, I think that's one of the challenges of a bigger classroom. Our licensing ratios in the state of California is for preschool, it's 1 to 12. So you can have one teacher with 12 2-year-olds, for example. We have a smaller ratio than that because I don't want my teachers to quit every 2 days. So with our 2-year-olds, the ratio gets bigger the older they get. With our 2-year-olds, it's 1 to 6. With our 3-year-olds, it's 1 to 8, and then with our 4 and 5s, it's 1 to 12. Sometimes, like when we have, because of how our center is subsidized, if we have people who can afford the kindergarten, then we will have a bigger class, like 1 to 20, because that's what they're going to experience when they matriculate. But the actual operations, like the class flow, I think is sometimes stymied because of the ratio obligations. And the curriculum we do works fabulously. We have something in the range of 85% of our kids go. We prepare them for advanced kindergarten, which is like on that AP, IB, International Baccalaureate track, or they just skip into kindergarten. And I do realize that that interest driven needs a smaller set of kids. I don't know if you ever heard of the Summerhill School in England.
Oh, I haven't.
It's this really interesting school. I don't even remember when it was started, but some of the pictures are in black and white. So I guess it was started a long time ago.
Yeah.
We're all familiar with Reggio Emilia, but the Summerhill School is where kids kind of go And it's like working on a farm, but being a preschooler. And it's so interesting that the things that they do there are it's very interest driven, but it's also very empathy driven. So you build your internal emotional capacity because you find interest in you're trying to find interest in everything. That's sort of the point. I think we in education miss that part where we have student interest, but then we're like, well, how can you find interest in everything we do, right? If you dig ladybugs, how's about you see these spiders and get interested in those too, right? And I think that's to me, I think that's sometimes the gap, both in educators and in parents, oh, my kid doesn't like, well, how do you get them to like it,
Right. And I love that you mentioned parents as well, because I think that's a huge aspect that a lot of centers miss the mark on, that it does include the parents as well. So, parents might not have the knowledge that we have in the sense of, the interest based and the developmental aspect of children and stuff like that as well. But they're a huge part into education and the performance of children as well. We follow a model that I'll definitely share with you as well. It's called How Does Learning Happen? And that is the model that we follow here in Ontario through the Ministry of Education that basically shows the connectivity of how learning happens. So taking a look at the environment being a huge contributor to the learning experience, because as we know, the environment is the third teacher, right? So the environment should speak even before the teacher does. The environment, the community, parents, and how the teachers work together to be able to implement how children and how does learning naturally happen in the world as well. So that's another document. And I thought of that when you mentioned that, because it's more than just the interest based as well. As you mentioned, it's about getting everything together in an ecosystem, like you said, looking to look at that in a larger aspect of how all of those connecting pieces can connect to the success of the child. And ratio is a good aspect as well. If you have too big of a ratio, you're not going to be able to have that attention for sure. Here, the ratio is a little bit different, I think, than yours. So technically, preschool for us would start at 2.5 to about 3 to 4. And that is actually 1 to 8 for those ones. And then before that, which is, I guess, like 18 months to 2.5 years old, that would be 5. And then it moves up to 12 and 13 and all that stuff as well. So it's pretty much almost the same. But I think also it sounds like where you guys are as well, you guys have a little bit more of ability to change, to make the changes that you need for your program, which is excellent. Because smaller group sizes is what you're going to get, which is going to come out of, in terms of, having happier teachers that are more relaxed to be able to give the child and the children in the classroom the specific time they need to be able to learn about those skills and all of those things as well. So that ratio is a huge thing. I know here in Canada, they were proposing, I think it was last month, that they were going to increase the ratio, and everybody got on their computers and they were like, nope, we're not letting this happen. And they didn't go ahead with it, thank God. But it's a huge aspect that people don't ask. And I think it goes right along with the fact that, getting society to understand that we're not babysitters. So you can't pack children in a classroom and expect us to work magic, because there's real work that's happening in early childhood classrooms that society doesn't really see.
But see, there's the rub with private centers, because our reimbursement rates in the United States are so low that, and I mean, I realize that it's a big hunk of money for families individually to pay, but when you consider that there's rent and light, I as a preschool owner, I want to be able to send people for professional development, get resources, improve the center, improve the experience for children. It's expensive. And I can see the allure of saying, let's just put a couple more kids. It's only 2.
Yeah, right. It's not going to hurt.
Because, here's a good statistic to think about that people don't know. The profit margin in, let's say, food, right? And food and beverage is somewhere like 80%. So 20% is the cost of it. About 80% is profit. Or, you can use it to reinvest or whatever. In preschool, a really good margin is 30%. That's if you're making 30% of if 30% of what you're bringing in is in that profit for improvement, staff, above and beyond just expenses, you are crushing it. That's top tier. I think the average is somewhere between 18 and 20%. So the money that you bring in, almost every single dollar is going specifically for the care of the kids in your building. There's no frivolities. There's no, I don't know. I haven't figured it out, but there's some ways to, get really rich or make a lot of money, but this is not the kind of profession to get in if you want to make a lot of money, because the profit margins are so narrow and you need profit margins to build up a savings. Like we had San Bernardino. I always say, I don't know why God hates this place, because it's always hot, hotter than anywhere, windier than anywhere, rainier. And so the wind blew off part of our roof and ruined our fire alarm system. And it was a $5,000 repair.
Oh no!
So there went our savings. One night, one really windy, rainy night, and $5,000 later, it's done. So it's hard when you're talking about private centers to kind of balance. You want to provide high quality, but then at the same time, because there's not a lot of support that you get from federal or public money, that sometimes you do have to compromise your program a little bit, you know?
Yeah, that's definitely kind of the same as well here.
Okay.
There are funding models for certain aspects of the program. Like I mentioned, if a center that is for profit, has a certain amount of children in the center, and they can get subsidized care for the families. So if they fit under that model where they need subsidized care, they can get that. But in terms of those things that you're mentioning, like the savings and repairs and stuff like that, usually for-profit childcare centers usually get mixed under the rug and don't get access to that, because exactly like you're saying, you have to pick between quality and, fixing the center and all of those things as well. So that's a huge aspect here. There are a few resources that are out there, and I know that it's in process here in Canada for sure, especially with COVID, unfortunately shutting down a lot of centers here in Canada.
Really?
Yeah. So a lot of centers did end up shutting down because they just couldn't make it. With the rules that we had in terms of not being able to, charge parents, obviously, because they're not using care and all that stuff, saving space,
right.
For rent. So it did end up having, with a lot of centers actually closing and shutting their doors for good. So I'm actually on my side, I'm hoping to be able to see, funding appear with advocacy, of course, of us as well, to help support for reopening centers that are for-profit, whether for-profit or non-for-profit, reopening centers and giving them those funding that they need, because I've worked in the last center I worked with, I oversaw 45 childcare centers. It's a corporate company, and, there's money for that all the time, but, it's the small centers that it's really heartbreaking to see them close, because those are usually family run and stuff like that as well. So, but you're right. It's the funding for those.
Yeah. I mean, I think, and that's why people usually have multiple, because if you have one center that makes $5,000 a year and another that makes $5,000, and then you have 6 of them, then you have a little bit more money to work with, as long as nothing happens at all of them at the same time.
Right.
But, until you get to that point where you have multiple centers, you really are it's almost like a paycheck to paycheck circumstance. And I think that oftentimes in the conversation about early childhood education, and we talk about the cost, when we say quality, we know what that means, but quality also means having good playground equipment and, things like that.
Teachers, all of those things as well. Yeah.
So what would you describe, when someone says what's a high quality program, what would you define are aspects and elements of a high quality program?
Great. So I have a long list, but I'm going to shorten it.
You can make it long. I got nothing to do until 12 o'clock.
Right. Yeah. I would say first and foremost, well-trained teachers that are passionate, well paid, and just have an eagerness to learn. Learning doesn't stop. And, I find that a center that has quality will, subsidize that in a way or pay for that. So teachers don't have to worry about that coming out of pocket. But well-trained and educated educators that are paid well, I would say, materials and toys that are accessible, to the center. So, it's not a center choosing between, something really great or something not that great because they just don't have money. So having those toys and materials that basically enhance the environment, great environments that are focused on inclusion and diversity. That's a quality center, recognizing that every child comes from a unique family. Right. Is a huge thing as well. So I would say that that's a high quality center. A leader that understands that the center or the business is a community. I would say that that's a part of quality as well. So, it's not just, the staff versus the parents, it's the whole, everybody within, all the stakeholders within actually work together as a community. And parents feel that when they go in to do tours. If it's a community where they feel welcome and the staff are happy and they get to know your children, it feels like a little mini family. I would say that that's quality as well. And I'm a person of compliance as well. I've worked in corporate. I was a senior area director. So, the actual environment having a look of quality in the sense of things not broken, walls put together, floors looking good, all of those little things as well for quality. But I would just say a program as well that is focused on just the success of the family and the child. End of the day, and supporting them through resources any way possible. Because as I said, it's like a community. It should feel like a little community within the center. But those are a few examples I would say in terms of what quality would look like.
Well, given that, what advice would you, because this is, again, it's a podcast for parents, teachers, and administrators. Of any of those three folks, what advice would you give, for a parent or a teacher or an administrator or all of them?
So for a parent, I would say my advice for a parent is knowing what to look for in terms of quality, obviously making a pick for a center that works best for them, but also being sure that they have a mindset that the center is a community as well. So working together with staff, working together with the administrators and supervisors as well to solve problems and to configure things, because sometimes things can get a little bit rough. As we know, there are situations that may happen and may arise, but I think if parents have more of a community-based thinking when it comes to dealing with the centers, that will be helpful to the community and the environments as well within the center. So that would be my best advice for parents in terms of, being incorporated into centers, having the community thought process for that. Same thing for administrators and leaders and those playing directors and supervisor roles as well is, looking at the center as a community, taking ownership of the center in the sense of everything within it. And practicing effective leadership skills. I think that's a huge thing as well. I'm a huge advocate. I do a lot of coaching with new leaders and stuff like that as well. And I view leadership in a different way in terms of humility and vulnerability and growth. So having those three things together when approaching leadership, whether it's leadership of staff or being a leader on behalf of the families, those are all huge aspects to consider when taking on a leadership role, is having those three qualities for sure. So that would be my best advice for the leaders and the owners, is to have that mentality when dealing with the center. And for staff, just upholding the profession. We're educators by trade as well. We know the struggles of society not identifying us as professionals and educators in this field. So we're all fighting together for that. But I would say the one aspect is making sure that we're upholding that quality, because I've done a lot of work in the field where, I've worked alongside teams that would complain that society doesn't look at us as respective professionals in education, but we're also doing the very opposite of what we're supposed to be doing to be looked on as professionals. So I say all that to say, just making sure we're upholding that standard of professionalism in the field so that we can continue to advocate together. So that would be my best advice for educators as well.
That's really good, especially that piece about teachers. Well, I mean, I think the common theme for everybody is that your behavior should be a role model for what you are. So if you're a parent, you should be a role model parent. If you're a teacher, you should be a role model teacher. If you're an administrator, you should be a role model administrator. Because I think one good thing about the pandemic that I have heard again and again and again is that everyone has a different appreciation for what their children are really like and what teaching is really like.
Right.
So I think this pandemic was the best advertisement the education field could have ever done.
Yes, exactly.
Because, people are having to be real. And it's so interesting. I've heard people say they would have called themselves being harsh before the pandemic. And now they're like, no, my child is really difficult.
I don't know how you do it. Yeah.
I don't know how you deal with my child. I've heard that dozens of times.
Yes.
Which I think is really interesting. And it speaks to the fact that, your regular life doesn't overlap with your kids' real life enough. If you're so far connected that it took a pandemic.
Yeah.
And, I'm just saying, for you to realize what your kid was really like, there should be more overlap.
Right.
And I find, on the other side with administrators and teachers, they're at home trying to work.
Yes.
And they realize what it's like to be a working person. And they have a different sympathy or different empathy for parents because they're like, oh my God, this is hard.
Yeah.
So, as we think about community and we move forward in community, sharing what your actual experience is like may be a way to get at what you're saying. Because it's true, like no one puts on each other's shoes. And I think the advice that you're giving really is encouraging people to share shoes so that they can see a perspective that's different than their own.
Yes, for sure. Absolutely. It's funny you say that it took a pandemic. It really did. I think a lot of people use that as an example too. It really takes a pandemic. But yes, I've heard all of that as well, working with different families, is that now they realize, most parents did realize our job was not easy. But it really took a pandemic to be able to, discover that it's more than just watching a few children in the classroom. It's about learning about each individual one, catering to them, educating them, making sure that they're happy and successful, times 8, depending on how much kids you have in your room. So we'll say that that's a minor blessing that happened in this.
Let's hope we don't have to have another global crisis for people to have an appreciation, for what we do. But I will say thank you so much for this conversation. I think this is kind of like how the sausage is made in preschool, but in a way that doesn't, it's not like Slaughterhouse 5 or what is it? The Upton Sinclair novel. It's not so messy, but I think there's a really good peek inside of what it's like. Some of the guts of childhood. So I really appreciate this conversation.
Me too as well.
So that's our conversation for today. I hope you found some information that was interesting or a perspective that you hadn't thought of. If you like what you heard, or even if you have some feedback, put a comment in our comment section. Be sure to like our page and make sure that you subscribe so that you can hear when the next video comes out. Thanks so much again for joining us.